In part 2 of my discussion of the 5 attempts to explain false beliefs in the Theaetetus, 187, I'm still in this block here of Stephanus numbers 187 to 200D. Part 2, I'm looking at attempt 3. So in part 2, I am looking at the way of explaining false belief as this kind of other judging or swapping. Now, we should pay attention to a little bit of the history of the actual text of the Theaetetus. That is, it's not the case that we can say with any, absolute certainty that we have, the document right from Plato's own hand. We think that we've got pretty good representations in the documents that we have of what Plato wrote, but we can't say for sure. So that's why I say keep in mind that the Theaetetus dialogue, like other dialogues, like other works from antiquity, we often have several competing manuscripts, and scholars try and put them together, and they compare and they contrast these manuscripts and try and figure out what was probably the original manuscript. But we don't have that. We don't have a copy of the Theaetetus that comes all the way from Athens in the time of Plato. We don't have something like that. A lot of the documents we have, are centuries later. And we can only trace the actual origin of the document back so far. So it's a little bit of a jigsaw puzzle. There is, shall we say, informed analysis. It's not just guesswork. Right? We don't just make this stuff up, but there's room for argument. So what I put up here, you can have a look, is that the Theaetetus dialogue, the manuscripts that have come down through history to us, they do disagree in places, but so again, they're like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle that you're trying to put together and you don't know what the whole picture is supposed to look like. So even though you say, oh, well, maybe we have everything around it, so we know what the shape, the general shape of the whole is, so we know what the general shape of that piece. But wait a second, it might be several pieces that we're missing. So if you have a jigsaw puzzle and you don't know exactly what the picture is, and you have a hole in the middle, yeah, you know the contours of the hole, yeah, but you don't know what's really inside of it, and you don't know if there's 5 little pieces in there that fit in weird ways, or if it's one big piece that fits the whole contours of the hole. That involves some kind of analysis where you're referring to other parts of the dialogue, so on and so on. So the Greek part of this manuscript the Greek part of the dialogue in the manuscripts tends to be corrupted. So we're not really clear. There seems to be grammatically some terms missing. So we got to fill this in, try and make sense. We do this all the time. And of course, people argue about how other people fill things in. All right, so there's lots of ink spilled over this one. Well, there's lots spilled over all of them, but this one has its own, shall we say, truckload of spilled ink. And some say that the third attempt really is just a restatement of the first attempt. You can push that line. It's not unreasonable to say that maybe that this is just a copy editor kind of copied and pasted in other things. So remember, these dialogues have gone through several hands over the centuries. And you know what it's like. It's like a game of telephone, right? Something goes in at one end and people talk about it, and by the time it gets around, it can be quite different. Manuscripts are often like that. Anyways, we can try and figure something out here. So, but the gist of it is Socrates says that error, right? So error and false belief, getting it wrong, is some kind of swapping thing, right? One for another. And as you can see, that resembles clearly that, misidentification. So getting it wrong is going to be thinking the wrong thing in place of the right thing. So, and if you're thinking, wow, that's a little bit circular because you're trying to explain what getting it wrong means, and you're using wrong in the explanation of getting it wrong. Isn't there some circularity? Yep, there is. So, but in any case, we just do the best that we can. So, Socrates says that false judgment is other judging or swapping. So, for instance, if someone says, X is ugly, and when in fact X is beautiful, what's going on is the term ugly is being inserted in place of of beautiful, and that's the error. She's got the wrong word in there. And in that sense, you're thinking the wrong thing in the place of the right thing. Well, Socrates starts to think about what thinking is. And there's an interesting little digression here. So Socrates says, okay, yeah, thinking. What is thinking? What exactly are we doing? And it's quite a fascinating little one, located at Stephanus number 190. What exactly is thinking? So Socrates says, just at the end of about 189e, line 10-ish, Socrates says something like this. Well, that's an interesting one, this thinking wrong thing, and okay, Theaetetus, that sounds pretty interesting. But I'm wondering something. And whenever Socrates says, I'm wondering something, you think, okay, we're going to introduce a side topic. Yeah, so he wants to talk a little bit about what thinking is. And he says, okay, Theaetetus, by the term thinking, do you mean the same thing that I do? And Theaetetus says, well, what do you mean by thinking? All right, so we have this lovely little digression, very famous digression here, and it's a short one. Socrates says something like this. Well, what is thinking? It's a talk which the soul has with itself about the objects under its consideration. So it's a little conversation that your soul is having about things that it's considering, talking itself over. So it's interesting that he thinks of it as a conversation, as talking. Of course, and in other places in Plato, the notion of the divided self comes up, and some Plato does hint that maybe our internal selves are actually multiple, like a little community. This notion of the divided self is not a strong one in the history of philosophy. You don't really see it come roaring out until centuries later when you read David Hume. And I always say, if you've read David Hume on the self and it doesn't bother you, then you probably haven't understood what he's saying. He really talks about a divided self, and the notion of the unity of the self is fiction. I don't think you say Plato goes that far, but he suggests it in places, and you can read it in. All right, so this conversation, he says, yeah, it's a little talk about its objects under its consideration, and of course, Socrates, I'm only talking about this under my ignorance, but it's the kind of picture I have of it. It seems to me that the soul, when it thinks, is simply carrying on a discussion in which it asks itself questions and answers them itself, affirms or denies. So when you're mulling things over and thinking, you're talking to yourself, only you're doing it quietly, right? And of course, some of us, I'm bad for this, is you start muttering usually when you're thinking, right? Well, you start talking to yourself. Well, Plato would say, well, that's just an externalization of what's going on inside. Your soul is talking to itself. So when you're thinking and you start saying stuff out loud and people look at you, well, that's no big deal. You're just saying out loud what's going on in here. And that's what we all do. All right, so it affirms, denies, and when it arrives at something definite, so this is a notion of a dialectic, going back, forth, well, what about this, and you go back and forth. That's the rough idea of a dialectic. It arrives at something definite, either by a gradual process, hemming and hawing and going back and forth, or a sudden leap. Sometimes you go, ha. When it affirms one thing consistently and without divided counsel. So somehow thinking is a bit of a division of the mind, a splitting of the mind. Fascinating idea. Your mind kind of splits, or maybe, so does your mind, is it a unity and then it splits and then it reconstitutes itself? So this true basis is a unity, or is its true basis of being a mind really a community, and then it's only when everybody agrees they all come together and you have this unity. So it raises some really interesting topics. And again, Plato the master, just his throwaway things are quite fascinating. So when it arrives at something definite by a gradual process or a sudden leap, when it affirms one thing consistently without divided counsel, we call this its judgment. So it's like a settling down and coming to some sort of settled discussion. Yeah, that's a judgment. So when you're with a group of people, so as the analogy could go, and you're bantering things back and forth, you're arguing stuff, and then boom, you come to a decision. right? Yeah, we came to a decision. Sometimes it's slow and terribly painful, or sometimes it's quick and everyone goes, yay, meeting over. But the idea is there's a dialectic that goes back and forth. And so to judge is to make a statement, and a judgment is a statement which is not addressed to another person or spoken aloud, but silently addressed to oneself. So it's an internal state of the soul. That's a judgment, or a belief, if you like. And that's different than talking to other people. All right, and so what do you think of that? What do you think about that, says Socrates to Theaetetus. And yes, Theaetetus says, I agree with that. Here, Socrates. So when a man judges one thing to be another, what he's doing apparently is to say to himself that one thing is another. So it's the soul in engaging, talking to itself. This is an internal dialogue. All right. So you can go through that passage. It's a lovely little passage, and reflect on it. Is that kind of what's going on in your mind when you're thinking about things? Is this sort of internal mulling and this dialectic going back and forth in terms of affirmations and denials, and then bang, settling on it. Centuries later, Kierkegaard, thought that decision making was madness, and then it's the point of madness, and then you come to a decision. John Dewey talks a lot about this, 20th century. So from a 19th century Danish philosopher to a 20th century American philosopher, John Dewey talks about, the mind going back and forth. That's how we think. In his lovely little 1910 book, How We Think, he talks about the mind going back and forth and wobbling and all over the place, and then eventually settling in on something. Kind of like when you have an elastic and you stretch it, or a spring, and it goes like this until finally it settles into a state. That's what our mind is like. All right, so if that's really what's going on with thinking, then what about this other judging or swapping? What kind of sense does that make if that's what we want to use to talk about error? Well, says Socrates, if a judgment or belief is the soul making some kind of silent statement about itself, then it would have to be that the soul, when it makes a mistake, is saying that one thing is another to itself, right? That it's saying this to itself. And so that X and Y are both the same. Could this really be done? Socrates puzzles about this. He says, could you really think that a cow is a horse? Is that possible? Right? Is that because that's what you're doing under this idea of explaining error as a kind of swapping or another thinking? Can you really do that? Socrates says, well, yeah, you can say it. I mean, right? When people say, oh, you can't think that. Remember, you can say things. I can say, that a round square exists and it's over there in the corner. I can say all those kinds of things. But can I really think that, right? Can I really think a contradiction? Can I really think that a cow is a horse, right? Again, I can say it. I can utter the words. But am I really thinking it when I do that? Socrates says, I don't think that can be rationally done or legitimate. It certainly can't be legitimately done. Could it really be done and you're a rational individual? Maybe that's a sign of insanity if you can do that. I don't know. Socrates is very puzzled by this. He says that doesn't seem to be possible. He doubts that you could actually think a cow is a horse if you're still a rational individual. And remember, not just uttering it or writing it down or whatever. Anybody can do that stuff. That's easy. But logically, can you really think it in this sense of a settled judgment? Yes, a cow is a horse. He doesn't think that can be done. And if that's our explanation, once again, for an error is to say, oh, it's thinking in this way, and you say, but you can't think in that way at all. Once again, it's not going to work, right? Because it's going to force us into saying that we can do something that we can't in fact do. So once again, to explain error, you're going to have to force us into saying we're doing something that we can't do while it looks like we've had another failed attempt. So is this possible? Socrates says no. So again, if what you've got is in our third attempt makes error or false belief judgment into thinking a contradiction. That's how it explains it. You're thinking contradictions. All right? But you cannot do this. You can't think contradictions. But you can make those false judgments. So if you can make a false judgment and I say, oh, you're thinking a contradiction. No, I can't think a contradiction. Well, then you're stuck with, I don't have an explanation for a false judgment because it's forcing me to say I'm doing something that I cannot in fact do. So you can do this, you can't do that. Well, that is, you can't think contradictions. Hence, this is not an explanation of false judgments and beliefs. Okay? So, guess what? The third attempt, so number 3, fail. We have another failed attempt. But we're looking at things, but cheer up. There's good cause for cheer here. We are getting better at explaining what thinking is, thinking more about thinking, ruling out, well, we've got some ideas of what false beliefs and judgments aren't. We've eliminated some possibilities. So that's some progress, and this is like a microcosm of the dialogue in general. We still don't know what episteme, knowledge is, but we know it's not his thesis. So we're weeding some things out. We still don't know what false judgment is, but we know it's not a misidentification or thinking that which is not, or an other judging. I got that out of the way, so we're getting there. Cheer up. Now, Socrates says, we're going to get into all kinds of absurdities with this. And Theaetetus says, well, what are all these absurdities? Can we dig deeper? Socrates says, I'm not going to go into all that. I just want to look at a couple of more possibilities here. And he says, we want to find this out so we want to find out more about the possibility or why we make false judgments or what these false judgments are, because we can somehow secure our dignity, to round out our knowledge. And he also admits that if he can't find a solution, he uses a metaphor, he's going to feel like, he's out at sea and he's seasick on a boat that's, in rough weather and tossed about by the argument. And remember, that relates back to an earlier metaphor, once again with lawyers and philosophers. The lawyers are chained to their arguments, right? Because they got to make them in a certain time. The argument is like, oh, we got to time by the water clock, where the philosopher is at leisure to examine the arguments in general. So we as philosophers control the arguments. The arguments don't control us. Water clocks don't control us. We are the free thinkers and free spirits. So Socrates says, look, so far these 3 attempts have taught us that we're making perhaps some incorrect assumptions. So Socrates goes back and looks at some of the assumptions that we've been making. Maybe maybe we were some of the conditions that we laid down back in the first misidentification, attempt 1, maybe that was a problem. Maybe that dichotomy of knowing, not knowing, maybe that was too strict. Maybe we could lighten up on that one a little bit. So that's another good example about how you reason about things. You put things in place to reason with, and if things go south, you look at your presuppositions, you re-examine those, go back and, maybe I'll try something a little different. Kind of a guess and fix up. Scientists do this all the time, philosophers do this, trying things out. So the dialogue as a whole, if you pull back from the Theaetetus, it is a good example of philosophical reasoning and process, right? He's thinking about things, trying certain things, this doesn't work, pulls back, tries something else. Aristotle's works are full of this kind of stuff. All right, so Socrates says maybe it might be possible for the the soul to judge something that it knows is something that it does not know. Maybe we were a little too strict. And so in that sense, maybe we now, remember in the first attempt, we did not talk about the soul coming to know or coming to not know, right? The process of learning or the process of forgetting. That was taken off the table as a simplification to dig right into the discussion of the misidentification problem as argument, as a solution to error. Socrates is going to go back to that. And in the next two attempts, the Wax and the Avery models, he's going to look a little bit more deeply at processes of coming to know things. So the Wax model will look at the process of how things are kind of stamped on us, and knowledge is sort of like a reception of some kind of imprint. And in the Avery example, he's going to compare the mind to this flock of birds and see how that looks. That's also a common metaphor in a lot of literature in philosophy and in novels as well. So, but for now, we've got 1, 2, 3 failures. And in the next video, we're going to check out the Wax example. That's going to fail too, but we'll see why it does. Stay tuned.